Good afternoon. Welcome to the weekly edition of The Wrap. I'm Laura Leslie, WRAL Capital Bureau Chief.
And I'm Bryan Anderson, WRAL State Government Reporter.
And I'm sorry we didn't have one last week. We all got kind of crazy about noon on Friday when that decision came down from the state Supreme Court, throwing out a couple of the constitutional amendments that were put on the ballot and passed back in 2018. It was obviously a big story. A lot of us working on that, trying to figure out exactly what that decision said. Didn't actually throw out those amendments, right, Bryan? But it did say basically give the lower court judge, Judge Collins, sort of his blueprint to do that.
Right. So it goes back to the trial court level where it was originally heard. And for context, for people who are unfamiliar, there were a string of amendments, constitutional amendments that were passed around the time of these racial gerrymandering concerns in the legislature. And a couple of measures, including a cap on income taxes.
Mm-hmm.
Originally, it was 10. The law at the time was, I think, 10%, and then they tried to get the cap to 7%. We're still nowhere near that. I think we're phasing the corporate income tax to 0% by the end of the decade. So it's that one's not really as controversial as certainly the voter ID one. But both passed by voters overwhelmingly, strong margins, double-digit margins for that. But the interesting thing is, there's a question of what precedent is being set by the state Supreme Court, because they basically said, hey, if you're a lawmaker and you were elected on the heels of being a benefactor from this racial gerrymandering.
Well, I mean, and we should say it's not just that you were elected in a racially gerrymandered seat. You were elected, and then the court said your district was racially gerrymandered.
Right.
So, like, it has been ruled, and they've told you have to redraw the maps, but for right now, you're still in office de facto, right?
Right. And it doesn't really seem to affect laws you pass as much as it does constitutional amendments you push for. So it is a little bit more narrowly tailored of a decision than people might be extrapolating it out to be, but it certainly could set a concerning precedent. But people I spoke with said, racial gerrymandering is a thing of the past. Partisan gerrymandering is where the debate really is going to be at going forward. It's hard to say racial intent and drawing maps if you can claim we're not looking at racial data. So we'll see what happens, but it sharpens focus on the Supreme Court races this year. Republicans just need to win one of the two seats currently held by Democrats up for grabs in order to reclaim control, and they're certainly going to be messaging this as an issue.
Absolutely. And we heard a lot of that this week at the legislature. This was a skeleton session week. So legislators were in Tuesday and Thursday of this week. They weren't taking any votes on any items. They're just doing their monthly check-in. So we certainly heard quite a bit about judicial activism and Speaker Moore talking, repeatedly about they should take off their black robes and put on blue robes because this is hyper partisanship at its finest. And I'm so disappointed in the Supreme Court. He insists that there's nothing like this that has ever happened in any state, that the court has come in and thrown out amendments that were passed by the legislature. I mean, I don't know that that's true. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer like he is, and I don't have that kind of encyclopedic knowledge of what's happened in other states, but it is pretty unusual. I mean, it definitely is pretty unusual.
Yeah. And so North Carolina politics, certainly a unique animal. And it sounds like we're going to maybe see some more fights going forward.
In the meantime, one of the items that people were talking about this week is Medicaid expansion. Legislators had said, I think even Governor Cooper had sort of alluded to the idea that perhaps there could be a deal on the table in August or September, as opposed to waiting until December.
I wouldn't hold my breath for that.
Yeah, I would say this week pretty much put paid to that notion. House Speaker Moore said, well, I'm not going to say it couldn't happen, but I'm going to say it's probably not going to happen. Basically, what we discovered is they're not even talking to each other. They're stuck in this stalemate that they've been stuck in. And that has to do with other reforms to the healthcare policy, the state's sort of healthcare policy rubric that the Senate wants to make as a part of expanding Medicaid. And the House says, we don't need to have that in the bill with Medicaid expansion. We can just do a clean expansion bill, and we can discuss these other changes that you want later, like certificate of need is one. Another one has to do with scope of practice for nurse practitioners, and some other advanced care practice nurses. Those are items that the Senate has been saying that they really want to have in it. The hospitals have been saying they don't want CON. Doctors, I don't think, want to see scope of practice and increase for PAs. And so, this whole thing has just kind of gotten into a morass, as things tend to do a lot at the legislature. And it doesn't look like there's anybody moving on anything anytime soon.
And to be clear, the they who are not talking to each other are the two Republican leaders, Phil Berger and Tim Moore. They're on the same side of the party. It's not a Democrat Republican fight. It's Republicans not talking to each other.
Well, that's an old saying at the legislature. The other party is the loyal opposition, but the other chamber is the enemy, and that is that is how it works sometimes. And so, yeah, so the two of them have not sat down and talked about this, which does not bode well for anything happening anytime soon. Moore said they are talking. The House, at least, has been talking to Cody Kinsley over at DHHS, and they are trying to get together an expansion. An expansion package that would pass federal muster. And they're hoping to do that in December and get it approved in December so that they could maybe make the deadline for this extra money that's sitting out there waiting for this year. But it's not clear whether or not they're going to get the Republicans of the Senate to come around in time to make that happen.
And it's not the only intra-party kind of concerns. One thing that did come up this week was a new book from the Lieutenant Governor, Mark Robinson. It's called We Are the Majority, The Life and Passions of a Patriot. It's coming out next month. And so I read this book, and toward the end of it, around like page 204 or 206, somewhere around there, Robinson talks about his views on education. And as part of that, he makes it pretty explicit that he doesn't believe history, social science, race and equity discussions. Science. History, science, race and equity, they should not be taught in K-5, well, grades 1 through 5 to be specific. And so there are, when President Trump was in office, people were pushing for the 1776 Commission for history to be a more patriotic history to be taught to children.
Sure.
So even whether Republicans or Democrats disagree on how history should be taught, there's pretty general consensus that the subject at least should be.
Yeah, don't know. Well, I think the Lieutenant Governor did walk that back a bit this week when he was asked about it at an event on Tuesday. But he is on the State Board of Education, so what he says about education really does matter, and it matters now, and it matters when we assume he's going to run for governor. So there was a lot of reaction to that this week from politicians, mostly people saying that they don't agree with it.
Yeah, I mean, here's his exact quote in the book. He says, in those grades being 1 to 5, quote, "We don't need to be teaching social studies. We don't need to be teaching science." So that's pretty explicit. And then when he was asked at an event about his views, he said, "No, we're not talking about not teaching science to elementary school children." So in its most generous form, that's a pretty big walk back. In what seems to be a more reasonable interpretation, that seems like a pretty clear reversal to me.
Yeah, in the meantime, this week, the House Select Committee on Advancing Women in STEM held its first meeting. It's when you stop and think about it, like there's so much focus on science right now, right? Getting kids into science earlier, getting them moving on this stuff. It's just an interesting push and pull within the Republican Party. Also of note, I happen to notice that the Select Committee on Advancing Women in STEM happens to be made up of 5 women and 7 men. Now, the women are in charge of it, but nonetheless, I was a little surprised to see that it wasn't a little bit more reliant on some of the female members in the House, given what it's about. That's not sexist to say. I mean, not saying that men cannot do things to advance women in STEM themselves, because of course they can. But I was a little surprised to see that.
It's a majority male coalition.
It is.
That's the surprising part.
Yeah. Anyway, other stuff that happened this week while they were in session, they both held gaggles, so we got to talk to them about a lot of things. One of them is abortion. And if you've been watching what's been going on this week in some of the primaries that we've seen and special elections in New York and other places, it's become pretty clear that abortion may end up being a bigger issue than people have been giving it credit for come this fall. We're seeing some sort of, I don't think anybody is saying right now that there's still not going to be a red wave. I think most people would assume that there's going to, because that's simply how midterms go historically. After the president's election, but it does seem like Democrats are doing better than a lot of pundits had predicted that they would do. So, which leads me to what our legislators want to do in terms of abortion laws. And we, talked to both House Speaker Tim Moore and Senate Leader Phil Berger to ask them, what they think. And they're both playing their cards very close to their chest. They're both saying, well, we haven't talked to the caucus about it. We talked to them about their personal views. Speaker Moore has said before he would favor a heartbeat bill, which would be about 6 weeks. Senator Berger said he would favor maybe first trimester, so that would be a 12-week ban, I guess it would be. But both of them were quick to say also they have not discussed this yet with their caucuses, so they could not say at this point what they will do. I will say that the Senator Leader Berger did say, and very carefully and specifically, I do not think you will see next year a total ban on abortions pass this legislature.
Yeah, I mean, certainly even among Republicans, and especially as we saw in other states, I think Kansas, people want to be able to have a choice, or at least want the laws to remain the same. And North Carolina is really not as much different with that, but we have seen more support for, a 20-week limit by, I think 57% of people in a recent WRAL poll said they favor drawing a line at 20 weeks with some exceptions for rape, incest, emergencies, and 31% oppose that 20-week restriction. But certainly when you dig deeper into that, people would rather have the laws stay where they are, more or less.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's clear from a lot of our polling that people do want to see some restrictions on abortion. The question is how much restriction and what kind. And, like right now, our 20-week ban being back in place now, since that judge made that happen last week, I guess it was, our 20-week ban does not include exceptions for rape or incest. And it includes exceptions for emergency, but they're very, very narrowly drawn. They were changed, I think, in 2014 or 2015. So it used to be sort of, in case of a risk of grave injury or illness or death, to the mother. And now it's got to be sort of a, life-threatening situation. So I did some reporting this week about, just how uncertain that's feeling for doctors and for providers, right, who are now having to operate under these rules to say, well, how sick is too sick? Like, when do you know where to draw that line? And we should point out, that 20-week abortions by and large are A, very, very rare, like less than 1%. And B, usually they're linked to a medical emergency or complication, right? Somebody preeclampsia or water breaking early or something along those lines. So, it probably won't affect a whole lot of people, but the argument that you'll get from some OBGYN folks is, unfortunately, the people that will be affected are the people who are really in a fix as it is, really facing some tough decisions, and they'll have to go face them and make those decisions in another state, probably.
And as we near the election, both parties are really messaging home this issue. We have the Republicans saying, vote for us. We need a supermajority in both chambers to affect change and override likely inevitable vetoes from Governor Cooper should we pass legislation. You have the Democrats saying Republicans want to go backwards in time, and the threat is very real for abortion rights if we don't at least prevent them from getting a supermajority. And it seems plausible for the Senate to have a supermajority. It seems plausible for a House supermajority, but a lot less likely than the Senate side of things.
Well, it's 3 seats versus 2.
Well, the maps have also changed so dramatically.
The maps are much more favorable to a Senate supermajority than to a House. But you know what? I don't know. I don't know that we know. Let's put it that way.
No, yeah, we'll see. But certainly, I think the Democrats are in a much better position than was thought 3 or 4 months ago as this issue's taken on heightened importance.
I think that's true. Absolutely. In the meantime, one thing that we talked about this week is teacher pay. And so, we legislators raised teacher pay by about 9% over the biennium in this past budget. They said it was great. Unfortunately, we're still sliding down the scale nationally. We're now back at 45th on starting teacher pay out of 51 or something like that.
I'm picturing like this extended foam finger for like, we're number 1, but you need like, we're number 45 or something like that.
Right. And then 47th in student funding, so I think you can, obviously lawmakers are making the argument they have increased funding, but the point is that everybody else seems to be increasing it faster than we are. In the meantime, of course, you have the Leandra decision coming up next week that okay, let me put it the way. The Leandra arguments coming up next week. Lord only knows when we're going to see the decision in that case. But we also, at the moment, have a pretty severe teacher shortage. We've got, I think I saw 4,400 slots open in Wake County for various staff and teachers. There's 11,000 some openings statewide, and that's not even talking to all of the districts yet. So it's about a quarter worse than it was last year, is what it looks like in terms of shortages. And for K-5 teachers, it's even worse. It's like 50% worse than it was last year. So, the question is, what exactly needs to be done to get teachers into classrooms? And Democrats yesterday were saying at a press conference, we need to come in and increase teacher pay and increase bonuses. And but Speaker Moore pointed out that in Wisconsin, apparently they pay teachers a lot better, and they've got an even worse shortage. So the question is, what is it going to take to get teachers back into classrooms? Is it really about the culture? Representative Reeves was talking a lot about the demonization of teachers in the current political climate, and how he thinks that's a disincentive to teachers to continue their careers in education. But Speaker Moore said he hadn't heard that. He said he thinks it has to do with burnout from the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, the other question is, can you ease the requirements needed for someone to enter the profession?
Do you want to do that, though? I mean, that's another question. Yeah, teachers.
How qualified should teachers be to instruct your children is the question. But when you have a shortage, you got to ask these tough questions, because someone's got to ultimately fill these positions, or you're going to have obscenely large class sizes that don't work.
Right, and one thing that I did hear from a viewer message me to talk, and she's a retired teacher, and she is currently substituting, but she's only making about a quarter of what she would make because her teaching certificate has expired. And under the law, she would have to go back to school for 18 hours of credit to get her teaching certificate back. So she called me up and said, maybe they should think about that, about waiving, saying if you had a teaching certificate for 30 years, you can have one at that point. I mean, it's like a lifetime hunting license. Like, you've kind of made your point there, right? I mean, and there are things, apparently, that there are some rules that have to do with retirement that penalize teachers who come back from working too much to fill in as teachers if they come back into the system. So, I mean, Speaker Moore mentioned that too as possibly another area that lawmakers could look at, sort of tinkering with, to see if they can help to ease this issue. Obviously, it's going to be too late to do anything for this year, because we're already about to start school Monday, and they don't even come back into session until September 20th, I think. But it's also true, as both sides have pointed out, that this is not an issue that's going away this year.
Yeah, and one other thing I should note, we've had a development from Truitt's office. She's the state superintendent of public instruction, and this latest budget had a provision that was concerning to some principals. Several hundred could see lowered salaries, because you're sort of evaluated for merit based on testing scores over the course of 3 years. That was sort of narrowed to 1 year. The concern being everyone struggled during the pandemic, so you can have principals see double-digit percentage salary losses from like $6,000 to $18,000.
That's a big hit, I mean.
Yeah. So what Truitt's trying to do is, draw from some of these federal funds to address a $4+ million shortfall that some principals might see. Basically, the point being that principals shouldn't be punished for a pandemic.
Yeah, and Speaker Moore and Senate Leader Berger both said that they would agree with that strategy. They would support that. Moore said he wasn't even aware of that change. He wasn't aware of the repercussions of it. But basically, they went from a 3-year look back on test scores to a 1 year, and it would only count for 2021, which is when schools were just getting reopened for the most part from the pandemic. So obviously a rough year for a lot of schools and a lot of teachers. So it sounds like they've got maybe a solution for that. It sounds like the legislature is not going to stand in the way. So I'm sure there's 360 or so very relieved principals today.
For sure. And one thing we should look forward to the election. We had an effort by the North Carolina State Board of Elections to sort of clarify some laws and tighten some rules for what election observers can do once they're at polling locations. These are partisan poll watchers, often employed by party officials to just make sure that elections run smoothly, that there's nothing nefarious going on. And during the May primary, there were reports in some counties, I believe Davidson and Wayne, to name a few, that there were these partisan poll watchers who were standing behind machines where you could observe someone marking a ballot and potentially see their private voting information,
Yeah.
concerns of just them not standing where they should be standing.
Getting too close to private information. There's one observer who got into a physical altercation with a voter in Allegheny County. And they also had some instances of observers following election workers in their cars back to the election headquarters from precincts. So yeah, I mean, things are weird right now. A lot of people making threats, a lot of people feeling very threatened. And so they wanted to pass these temporary rules because they said that they didn't have time to go through the entire rulemaking process. But this week, the Rules Review Commission said, sorry, you had time to go through the process and you didn't do it. So you don't just get to make these rules temporarily.
And the Rules Review Commission, for people who don't know, they're appointed by the legislature, which is Republican controlled. North Carolina State Board of Elections has three Democrats and two Republicans, but they had a unanimous decision advancing these temporary rules, and it drew some protests from National Republican Committee. It drew pushback from the state Republican Party, basically saying, the May 17th primary is long over. They could have issued these for weeks or months ago. Why are they doing it so close to an election? And for the state board, their response is, well, we did a survey after the election and got responses from 43 different counties. That obviously takes some time to really understand the issue and hear their concerns. And we really see this as something that should happen in 2022. There's an appeals process that could happen, but it's not clear whether the state board will pursue that route.
Yeah, it's not clear. So we'll be following that next week, along with, of course, the Leandro arguments. I should say that, well, I will not be following it because I am off. I'm on vacation, so this is all on you, Bryan. Have a good time.
I appreciate it. Yeah. You're going to be here for the month or two before the election every week, I hope.
Yes, sir, I will be. Yes, this is it for the year. So anyway, I think that's it for this week, isn't it? Anything else we should have mentioned?
The one thing I do have to say is we did have that story on Robinson, and there's other takeaways besides his education comments. He's running likely for governor in 2024. He all but announces that in his book, and he made some eyebrow-raising comments on racial issues, how his views were formed, LGBTQ rights, same-sex marriage. So there's a lot more from this book to unpack, and we have that story at nccapital.com for folks who want to check it out.
All right. Well, failing anything else, then we will say thank you very much for joining us for this week's wrap, and we hope you'll join us again next time.